Power doesn't always fall with a gunshot. Sometimes it whispers through paperwork, slides across contracts, and signs its name in ink. From Washington offices to foreign palaces, from small-town payrolls to the highest seats in government, corruption wears many faces. In this story, we descend 7 levels deep into that darkness. Each level reveals a woman who twisted authority in her own way. From falsified resumes and stolen checks, to bribes wrapped in gold, and finally, to murder used to silence truth itself. It begins quietly with lies typed on paper and ends in fire, where one life was taken just to keep justice from speaking. Every level goes deeper. Every story is worse than the last, and trust me, the final level is the one you will not believe. Before we start, I want to know something. What time is it where you're watching right now? And which country are you watching from? Type it in the comments. Let's see how far these stories travel across borders, across screens, and across time zones. Because as you're about to see, power doesn't just corrupt, it evolves. And the deeper we go, the darker it gets. Now, let's begin our descent. Level 1. Helen Renee Ballard. In the heart of Washington, D.C., where government jobs are meant to stand as pillars of fairness and opportunity, one woman found a way to turn the system into her personal family business. Her name was Helen Renee Ballard, a mid-level official in the General Services Administration, the agency that keeps the machinery of federal government running. To most, she was just another bureaucrat behind a desk. But behind those files and applications, she was quietly reshaping the rules to serve one purpose: her own circle. Ballard wasn't the face of political power. She wasn't giving speeches or shaking hands at ribbon cuttings. Instead, she operated in the shadows of paperwork, job postings, resumes, and hiring decisions that rarely make the evening news. Yet those quiet corners of power are often the easiest to bend. With the stroke of a pen, she could decide who got a steady paycheck and who never got a call back. And slowly she began filling those positions with familiar names. The plan was simple, but devastating in its implications. Ballard falsified resumes, dressing up relatives as qualified candidates. She created backstories that made them look like seasoned professionals rather than family members with thin work histories. Then she pushed those resumes through the hiring pipeline she controlled. On paper, these hires looked legitimate. In reality, they were the beneficiaries of a nepotism scheme, disguised as merit. For a while, no one questioned it. Family members were slipping into jobs meant for the public, and Ballard's authority made the hires look clean. But the longer it went on, the bigger the pattern became. A department meant to reflect the diversity of the nation was instead looking like one extended family reunion. The midpoint of her downfall came with a startling realization. Entire federal positions had been effectively auctioned off to her kin. Job seekers from across the country, people with real qualifications, people who had worked years for a chance to serve, were quietly being replaced by cousins, siblings, and distant relatives with resumes stitched together by Ballard herself. What was supposed to be one of the fairest hiring processes in the country had been turned into a mockery. The cracks began to show when whistleblowers noticed similarities in the documents. Certain resumes shared the same phrasing, the same formatting quirks, even the same typos. Background checks revealed inconsistencies, educational institutions that didn't exist, degrees that had never been awarded. And slowly, investigators pulled the thread that unraveled the entire scheme. What they uncovered was more than just a few favors for family. It was systematic misuse of government hiring authority, a betrayal of the principle that public jobs are earned, not handed out in secret. Each falsified resume was another lie entered into federal records. Another unqualified worker placed in a role that demanded trust. When Ballard was confronted, the facade collapsed. Court documents laid out the details of her nepotism web, exposing how she had leveraged her position to bypass every safeguard. She wasn't pocketing bribes. She wasn't laundering millions. Her corruption was quieter, but in some ways, more corrosive. She had corrupted the very gateway of opportunity, turning the hiring process into a family lottery. The trial cut through any illusions of oversight. The facts were plain. Ballard had abused her federal position to run a nepotism scheme, and she had lied to the government to make it possible. In 2012, she was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. A relatively short term, but a permanent stain on her name, and a public reminder of how even low-profile corruption eats away at trust. For those who lost jobs they never knew were stolen, Ballard's scheme meant more than numbers on a court docket. It meant careers delayed, opportunities denied, and the knowledge that the system had been rigged from the start. For the relatives she hired, it meant sitting in offices they hadn't earned, a living reminder of the fraud that put them there. Ballard's story doesn't have the violence or bloodshed of later levels, but it shows how corruption begins, not with bullets or bribes, but with favors disguised as fairness. She didn't have to threaten anyone or steal money in plain sight. All she needed was a pen, access to résumés, and the arrogance to believe no one would ever notice. Her downfall was proof that even small cracks in the system can spread into fractures. Because if hiring itself can be stolen, then trust in every level of government begins to crumble. And once that trust is gone, rebuilding it takes far longer than any 18-month sentence. This was level 1 of corruption. And if this is how it begins, with lies on paper and family in positions they never earned, then the question becomes, how much darker does it get as we descend to the next level? Level 2, Chunrong. On paper, Chunrong was the picture of achievement. Rising through the ranks of China's Communist Party, she became the vice governor of Liaoning province, a position that carried both prestige and power. Her job was to manage land, contracts, and public projects worth billions. To many, she was proof that women could break barriers in a system still dominated by men. But behind the photo ops and ribbon cuttings, she was carving up her province like it was her personal estate. How knew that land in China isn't just dirt and soil, it's currency. Entire fortunes rise and fall based on who gets development rights. A single contract can reshape a city skyline. And from her office, she had the power to sign or stall, to approve or deny. To the public, she presented herself as a guardian of growth. In truth, she was selling pieces of the province to line her own future. Developers learned quickly that access to How wasn't free. Projects that should have gone through open channels were steered quietly toward insiders willing to play her game. Land allocations went not to those who bid fairly, but to those who had connections, or who were willing to pay under the table. The contracts didn't just build infrastructure. They built How's influence. But misuse of power is never just about taking. It's about hiding. And How was a master at concealment. She signed off on reports that disguised diversions of resources. She approved budgets that looked legitimate, but funneled wealth into private channels. She built a reputation for competence, while she buried misconduct beneath a mountain of paperwork. The midpoint moment in her story, the detail that shocked even seasoned investigators, was that How didn't simply siphon resources. She actively orchestrated cover-ups against those who tried to stop her. Local officials who raised red flags found themselves reassigned, their warnings vanishing into silence. Complaints from citizens disappeared into drawers. In one instance, whistleblowers were directly pressured to retract statements, their careers threatened if they refused. How wasn't just dipping into the system. She was rigging the very mechanisms meant to catch her. For years, the strategy worked. On the surface, Liaoning province thrived. Construction projects rising, contracts signed, reports filed. But inside, resentment simmered. The same patterns kept repeating. The same developers winning bids. The same lands parceled out with suspicious efficiency. The same insiders walking away with profits. Eventually, investigators at the national level began noticing the cracks in Howe's carefully crafted image. The investigation wasn't quick. Howe had buried her tracks deep, and her allies within the bureaucracy worked to shield her. But as auditors dug through records and traced connections, the picture grew undeniable. Deals she had approved weren't clean. Resources meant for public benefit were rerouted into private hands. Entire neighborhoods had been reshaped by corruption. When the case broke, it hit like a shockwave. Chunrong, once celebrated as a high-ranking female official, was exposed as a symbol of the very corruption the party claimed to be fighting. Reports described how she diverted land, manipulated contracts, and covered her tracks with precision. The scale wasn't a matter of thousands, or even millions. It was a culture of abuse, wrapped around one office and one woman's ambition. In court, the evidence was overwhelming. Documents bore her signature. Witnesses testified to her direct involvement. Whistleblowers finally spoke openly about the pressure they had faced. Howe's defense collapsed under the weight of her own paperwork. In 2019, she was sentenced to 12 years in prison, her career and her carefully built image obliterated. Her story is a reminder that corruption at this level isn't just theft. It's theft camouflaged as progress. Citizens saw new roads and buildings and believed growth was happening fairly. What they didn't see was how the benefits were carved up before the projects even began. They didn't see how public trust was bartered away behind polished speeches and official seals. Howe's sentence was meant as a warning, but the damage had already been done. Generations of citizens had watched resources redirected, land carved away, and truth hidden under layers of bureaucracy. The betrayal wasn't measured only in yuan or in years behind bars. It was measured in the erosion of faith, in the sense that no matter how hard you worked, someone behind the desk was already deciding who would win. At level 2, corruption deepens. It's no longer favors for family. It's no longer about bending the rules at the edges. Here, the rules themselves are rewritten, concealed, and enforced with intimidation. Chunrong turned public office into a fortress that served herself, and for that, she paid with her freedom. But this was only the second level, and if contracts and cover-ups can rot an entire province, what happens when the price tag of corruption is open bribery? When entire cities are sold for cash in envelopes? Level 3, Maczka, Richardson, Texas, a growing city just north of Dallas, where families moved for good schools and quiet streets. For years, residents believed their mayor was protecting that dream. Maczka ran on promises of integrity, standing up at town halls and assuring neighbors she was listening to their concerns about development and zoning. She spoke like a guardian of community character. But in private, Laura was striking deals that would unravel her reputation. One payment, one renovation, one secret text at a time. Unlike faceless corruption in distant capitals, Laura's story happened on neighborhood blocks, in living rooms, at city council meetings. She wasn't stealing from anonymous strangers. She was taking from the very people who shook her hand after church, who trusted her to make decisions about where their children would grow up. The scheme began with Mark Jordan, a wealthy real estate developer. He wanted approval for a high-density apartment project that faced stiff resistance from the community. For ordinary citizens, zoning battles meant sleepless nights, petitions, heated debates. For Jordan, it meant opportunity. And he found his ally in the mayor. Laura's role should have been simple: evaluate the project on its merits, listen to residents, and vote accordingly. Instead, she began accepting what prosecutors later called a stream of bribes disguised as generosity. It started with campaign contributions, then gifts, then something far more tangible: a romantic relationship with Jordan himself. The midpoint revelation, the detail that stunned even her own constituents, was that Laura wasn't just secretly involved with the developer. She had moved into his luxury home, enjoying renovations and perks paid for by the same man asking her for favorable votes. While she told the public she was against high-density housing, she was literally sleeping in the house that corruption built. The cover was clever at first. Cash was disguised as loans. Free renovations were written off as help. Laura insisted she could keep her personal life separate from her public duties. But documents, emails, and text messages told a different story. "We're in this together," one exchange read, sent just days before she cast a decisive vote in Jordan's favor. For residents who had fought the project, the betrayal cut deep. They had filled meeting halls, pleading with their mayor to reject zoning changes they believed would hurt their neighborhoods. Laura looked them in the eye, nodded, and pretended to sympathize. Then she went home to a lifestyle funded by the very development they opposed. Investigators began piecing together the double life. Bank records revealed unexplained transfers. Contractors testified about home improvements covered by Jordan. The romantic relationship, once whispered about, became undeniable evidence of a conflict of interest turned full-blown bribery scheme. At trial, prosecutors laid it bare. Laura had accepted cash, renovations, and luxury perks in exchange for votes. She had betrayed not just the ethical standards of her office, but the basic trust of every Richardson resident who believed in her campaign promises. Defense attorneys argued the relationship was personal, not political, that love, not greed, explained her decisions. But the jury saw what the evidence showed. City policy had been for sale, and the mayor was the one selling it. In 2021, Laura Maczka was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. She left behind not just a ruined career, but a community scarred by the knowledge that the voice they trusted most had been speaking for someone else all along. Her downfall is more than a local scandal. It's a reminder of how easily power bends when money whispers. Laura didn't need to falsify résumés or bury documents like others before her. She simply opened the door of her own home and let corruption move in. For Richardson, the lesson was harsh. Development still goes on. Zoning fights still happen. But the memory of a mayor who traded votes for romance lingers. Neighbors who once believed the system worked now know how easily it can be twisted. At level 3, corruption no longer hides behind subtlety. It wears new countertops, drives luxury cars, and texts its accomplices with promises of loyalty. Laura Maczka turned her office into a marketplace, selling the future of her city one decision at a time. And if bribes can buy zoning changes, what happens at the next level? When influence isn't sold quietly, but demanded through threats, obstruction, and extortion. Level 4. Nadine Arslanian Menendez. For years, Nadine Arslanian Menendez moved through circles of wealth and influence as if she belonged there. The wife of then-Senator Bob Menendez, she was often seen in designer clothes, arriving at fundraisers, riding in luxury cars. But beneath the polished image was a story that prosecutors say turned her into one of the boldest figures in modern political corruption. Nadine wasn't just taking favors. She was trading access, demanding gifts, and interfering with justice itself. Unlike earlier cases where corruption hid in paperwork or quiet exchanges, Nadine's was brazen. She and her husband stood at the center of a scandal dripping with luxury, gold bars, stacks of cash, expensive jewelry, even a Mercedes-Benz parked outside her home. These weren't side benefits. They were the currency of an influence scheme that tied her marriage to powerful foreign interests and businessmen eager for favors. The deals operated like a shadow economy. In return for political access, Nadine and her husband received gifts that ordinary citizens could never dream of. The indictment described it bluntly: extortion cloaked as friendship. Businessmen seeking help with federal contracts or policy decisions weren't just asking politely. They were reminded, directly or indirectly, that loyalty had a price, and the Menendez household expected payment. The midpoint shock came when investigators raided the couple's home. What they found was a scene straight out of a crime thriller: envelopes stuffed with cash hidden in jackets, gold bars traced back to businessmen seeking favors, a brand new luxury car sitting in the driveway, registered in Nadine's name, courtesy of a wealthy contact. The home looked less like a senator's residence and more like a vault of ill-gotten gains. But Nadine's role didn't stop at collecting gifts. When whispers of investigation began, she crossed into obstruction. Prosecutors detailed how she interfered with inquiries, tried to shield communications, and used her influence to stall investigators. Corruption wasn't just happening. She was actively working to keep it hidden. For prosecutors, the case revealed a marriage where politics and personal gain blurred into one operation. Nadine wasn't a passive spouse enjoying her husband's position. She was described as an active participant, meeting with businessmen, conveying demands, and ensuring the pipeline of luxury never slowed. Gold bars weren't tucked away for emergencies. They were part of a lifestyle built on leveraging influence for personal enrichment. In court, the defense argued she was caught in her husband's shadow, that she had been swept up in a scandal larger than herself. But the evidence showed otherwise. Text messages and testimony placed her at the heart of the deals. She wasn't just a bystander. She was a negotiator, a gatekeeper, and at times, the one making sure businessmen understood exactly what was expected. In 2024, Nadine Arslanian Menendez was sentenced to 54 months in federal prison, 4.5 years. Her conviction marked one of the most high-profile corruption scandals to hit Washington in decades. The case left the public with searing images: photographs of seized gold bars, pictures of envelopes fat with cash, lists of gifts that read like luxury catalogs. They weren't metaphors. They were physical proof of how far influence had been abused. What makes Nadine's case so striking isn't just the greed, it's the confidence, the assumption that power could be turned into profit openly, that investigations could be obstructed, that nothing would touch her. Where others concealed their corruption under layers of deception, she and her husband displayed it in their closets, garages, and bank accounts. Her downfall is a reminder that corruption isn't always subtle. Sometimes it's flaunted, with gold bars on the table and cars in the driveway. And when arrogance meets investigation, the crash is spectacular. At level 4, the descent into corruption has reached a point where power doesn't just bend rules or sell favors. It threatens the system itself, daring investigators to act, daring the law to catch up. Nadine Arslanian Menendez gambled that access and obstruction would protect her. Instead, they became the evidence that sealed her fate. This is the point in the descent where corruption sheds its disguise. And as we step into the next level, we leave behind gifts and cash and enter something even more dangerous. When those entrusted with money don't just accept bribes, but steal directly from the very accounts they were meant to protect. Level 5. Kacie Lynn Paulk. Trust is a fragile thing, especially when money is involved. In offices across America, managers handle payrolls, cut checks, and balance books. Their authority is supposed to guarantee fairness, every cent accounted for, every signature authentic. But in one Texas office, that trust was shattered by Kacie Lynn Paulk, a woman who used her position not to protect finances, but to quietly drain them. Kacie wasn't a senator's wife or a high-ranking politician. She didn't stand behind podiums or pose for cameras. She was an office manager, the kind of person who keeps the day-to-day running smoothly. To her colleagues, she was efficient, dependable, even ordinary. And maybe that's why her scheme lasted as long as it did. Nobody suspected the person balancing the books was also skimming from them. The fraud began with a pen stroke. Kacie had access to company checks and the authority to sign off on expenses. At first, the amounts were small, sums that could slip through without notice, but greed rarely stays quiet. Soon, she was forging signatures and writing checks to herself, siphoning thousands at a time. Over months, the total ballooned to more than $60,000. The midpoint shock in Kacie's story came not just from the amount she stole, but from the method. She forged signatures so smoothly that even supervisors reviewing documents didn't catch it at first. To outsiders, the books looked balanced. To insiders, the theft was invisible, until the numbers stopped adding up. The unraveling began when routine audits flagged irregularities. Payments appeared that no one could verify. Vendors supposedly paid had no record of receiving money. And as investigators dug deeper, a pattern emerged. The forged handwriting, the recurring names on checks, and the consistent trail leading back to one person, Paulk herself. What makes financial theft like this so corrosive isn't just the dollars stolen. It's the betrayal of closeness. Her employers had trusted her with the keys to the safe, and she had used that trust as her weapon. Every forged check was a reminder that the person supposed to guard their finances had been robbing them blind. When confronted, Kacie's defense crumbled. The evidence was undeniable. Court filings revealed how she diverted funds systematically, how she cashed forged checks, how she disguised theft as routine expenses. What might have seemed like clerical errors were in fact deliberate acts of fraud. In 2024, she was sentenced to 4 years in state prison. For some, that may seem short compared to the scale of her theft, but the consequences stretched further than her sentence. Employers she stole from were left to rebuild accounts. Colleagues who once relied on her were left questioning how they missed the signs. And her reputation was destroyed in the very community where she once appeared trustworthy. Unlike corruption hidden in government contracts or political favors, Kacie's crime was painfully personal. It happened in small offices, on ledgers and checks people thought they could trust. And maybe that's why it stings so deeply. Because anyone who's ever trusted a colleague with money can imagine how easily the same betrayal could happen to them. At trial, prosecutors made it clear, this wasn't desperation. This wasn't survival. It was deliberate theft, repeated over and over until the numbers forced her exposure. Each check she wrote wasn't just a financial crime. It was a deliberate choice to erode trust, one forged signature at a time. Kacie Lynn Paulk's case stands at level 5 in our descent, where corruption leaves campaign donations and luxury cars behind and becomes direct theft from the accounts one is sworn to protect. No gold bars, no bribes disguised as favors, just ink on checks and the arrogance to believe no one would notice. Her story reminds us that corruption doesn't always wear a powerful title. Sometimes it sits at the next desk, smiling at you, balancing the books with one hand while stealing with the other. And if embezzlement feels intimate and corrosive, the next level plunges into something darker still, when authority doesn't just steal or extort, but preys on the vulnerable in the most intimate ways imaginable. Level 6, Pamela Smart. In the early 1990s, Pamela Smart seemed like the kind of young woman who had it all. She was 22, ambitious, and working as a media coordinator at a New Hampshire high school. To students, she looked like the cool adult in the room. Not a distant authority figure, but someone who understood their world, someone who blurred the line between mentor and friend. But beneath that image, Pamela was building a trap that would end in betrayal, blood, and a life sentence. Pamela's power wasn't political or financial. It was emotional. She found influence not in boardrooms, but in hallways filled with teenagers searching for approval. That's where she met William Billy Flynn, a 15-year-old student who admired her attention. To him, she wasn't just an older woman. She was glamorous, sophisticated, and willing to treat him as an equal. But her interest came with a hidden price. The relationship began as flattery, then flirtation, then sex. Pamela didn't just cross the line. She obliterated it. And once she had Billy under her control, she escalated her demands. Her marriage to Greg Smart, just a year old, was crumbling. Instead of facing divorce, she began whispering in Billy's ear. If he truly loved her, he would get rid of her husband. The midpoint shock in Pamela's story came from her chilling persistence. She didn't ask once in a moment of desperation. She pressured Billy repeatedly, grooming him to believe that murder was proof of devotion. She convinced him that killing Greg was the only way for them to be together. It wasn't passion, it was coercion weaponized. Lust turned into leverage. On May 1st, 1990, Pamela's plan unfolded. While she was conveniently out with friends, Billy and 3 accomplices broke into the Smart home. Greg Smart was ambushed as he returned from work. He was beaten, then shot in the head at point-blank range. At just 24 years old, Greg's life ended not in an accident or a burglary gone wrong, but in a premeditated killing arranged by his own wife. Pamela returned home to a crime scene staged to look like a robbery. She played the role of grieving widow, crying on camera, giving interviews, and insisting she wanted justice. For a while it worked. She charmed reporters, convinced neighbors, and even inserted herself into the investigation as if she were a victim desperate for answers. But whispers began to spread. Teenagers close to Billy knew more than they should. Rumors of an affair between Pamela and her student reached investigators. And then came the evidence that destroyed her carefully constructed facade: tape recordings. Billy's friends, cooperating with police, recorded conversations with Pamela. On those tapes, her voice was clear. She didn't just admit to the affair. She acknowledged the plot, criticized Billy for nearly bungling the plan, and discussed her fear of being caught. Those recordings were the smoking gun that transformed suspicion into certainty. In court, the story stunned the nation. Jurors heard the tapes, listened to Pamela's own words, and saw how she had manipulated a teenager into becoming her weapon. Prosecutors painted her as the mastermind who orchestrated every detail while keeping her hands clean of the actual killing. The defense argued she was guilty of poor judgment, not conspiracy to murder. But the jury saw through the excuses. In 1991, Pamela Smart was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, witness tampering, and accomplice to first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was 23 years old when the sentence was handed down, and she has been behind bars ever since. Pamela's case became one of the first true crime sagas to dominate American television. Her beauty, her youth, the shocking betrayal, it all fueled media frenzy. But beneath the sensational headlines was a darker truth. She had abused her authority over a vulnerable teenager, turning intimacy into manipulation and coercion into homicide. Decades later, Pamela Smart remains in prison, her appeals exhausted, her name forever linked to one of the most notorious teacher-student scandals in U.S. history. Billy Flynn, the teenager she manipulated, eventually admitted guilt and served time. But his story was always framed as that of a boy steered into violence by a woman twice his age. At level 6, corruption leaves money and politics behind. It becomes personal, intimate, and devastating. Pamela Smart's abuse of power wasn't about contracts or bribes. It was about control over another human being, using seduction as a leash and love as a weapon. Her story shows the most haunting kind of corruption, when someone trusted to guide the young instead exploits them and then pushes them to kill. And if this level feels like the bottom of the descent, it isn't, because the final level, level 7, reveals the most chilling abuse of all. When corruption doesn't just manipulate or steal, but silences life itself to bury the truth. Level 7. Kimberly Cargill. By the time Kimberly Cargill walked into a Texas courtroom, investigators had already uncovered the kind of crime that strips away any remaining illusions about power. She wasn't accused of stealing money. She wasn't accused of bending contracts. She was accused of something far worse, murdering a woman to erase her testimony. Kimberly's story begins not in office towers or government halls, but in a custody battle. She was fighting to retain rights to her son, and the case wasn't going her way. Social workers had raised red flags about abuse and neglect, and one of them, Cherry Walker, had been called to testify. Cherry wasn't a politician. She wasn't rich or powerful. She was a babysitter, a caregiver who had seen enough to speak the truth in court. And that truth threatened to take Kimberly's son away. For most people, a custody dispute means lawyers, judges, and painful hearings. For Kimberly, it became a line she refused to let anyone cross. If Cherry testified, Kimberly's control over her son would slip away. And in Kimberly's mind, that wasn't an option. The midpoint shock of her story is the choice she made next. Instead of preparing her defense, she prepared an execution. On June 18, 2010, Kimberly lured Cherry into a trap. Investigators later pieced together how she drove Cherry to a remote location, away from witnesses, away from safety. There, she attacked her. Cherry Walker, a 39-year-old woman with disabilities, described by friends as gentle and trusting, never made it home. Kimberly killed her to ensure that the truth she carried would never be spoken in a courtroom. But murder wasn't enough. Kimberly went further, trying to erase not just the witness, but the evidence of the crime itself. She set fire to Cherry's body, burning her remains in a desperate attempt to cover her tracks. It was obstruction at its most brutal. Destroy the life, destroy the testimony, destroy the evidence. The attempt failed. Fire doesn't erase everything. Investigators recovered enough to confirm foul play, and suspicion quickly closed in on Kimberly. Phone records, witness statements, and her history of hostility toward Cherry pointed directly to her. The very woman who had tried to silence the truth had left behind a trail that spoke louder than any testimony could. In court, prosecutors laid bare the sequence of events. They showed how Kimberly had a motive: to stop Cherry from testifying. They showed how she lured Cherry out, how she killed her, how she tried to burn the evidence. Witnesses described Kimberly's rage during the custody battle, her threats, her escalating desperation. Piece by piece, the jury saw the portrait of a woman who believed the only way to win was to kill. The defense argued Kimberly was overwhelmed, that the pressure of losing custody pushed her into irrational acts. But the jury wasn't convinced. This wasn't impulsive. It was planned obstruction carried out with lethal finality. In 2012, Kimberly Cargill was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Unlike the others in this descent, she didn't receive months or years in prison. She received the harshest penalty the law allows, a sentence that placed her on Texas death row, where she remains today. Her case marks the bottom of the spiral. Level 7 isn't about greed or ambition. It isn't about influence traded for gifts. It's about using death itself as a weapon to control the outcome of justice. Kimberly didn't just corrupt the system. She tried to erase it. For Cherry Walker's family, the pain runs deeper than legal battles. Cherry was described as kind, loving, and eager to help others. She trusted Kimberly enough to meet with her, never suspecting she was walking into danger. Her death is a reminder of what happens when the most vulnerable are targeted by those willing to abuse power in its most violent form. At this level, corruption no longer looks like contracts or envelopes of cash. It looks like a body silenced, evidence burned, and truth buried in ashes. Kimberly Cargill crossed every line, showing how far someone will go when they believe accountability is a threat to their control. And that's why her story closes this descent. Because once power reaches the point where life itself is expendable, there's nothing left to lose and nothing left to trust. 7 levels, 7 women, 7 ways power can be twisted and abused. From nepotism in Washington offices to gold bars in closets, from stolen checks in small offices to a witness silenced forever, each level reveals another layer of how corruption spreads when authority becomes a weapon. Helen Ballard filled jobs with family. How Chunrong carved up a province. Maczka sold out her city. Nadine Arslanian Menendez flaunted gold bars and cash. Kacie Paulk drained accounts she was meant to protect. Pamela Smart used seduction to coerce a killing. And Kimberly Cargill, she ended a life to bury the truth itself. This is the full descent. 7 levels, 7 betrayals, 7 warnings. And the question left behind is chilling. How many more levels remain undiscovered, waiting in the shadows of power? 7 levels down, and what did we find? Not just broken laws, but broken trust, jobs stolen, contracts carved up, bribes disguised as love, and in the end, a witness burned to ash so her truth would never be spoken. It makes you wonder, how many more levels are out there, hidden in the shadows of power, waiting to be exposed? Tell me in the comments. Which of these 7 stories shook you the hardest? And do you think corruption ever truly has a bottom? If this descent through abuse of power opened your eyes, don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you'll be the first to know when we uncover the next story they never wanted you to hear. Because power doesn't just corrupt. Sometimes it consumes.